Les villes, les communes et les régions progressistes font déjà beaucoup sur le terrain, quelle que soit la taille de nos municipalités. Je suis maire de la 40e ville la plus pauvre de France, une petite ville de 8 000 habitants dans la banlieue du Mans. Et nous avons comme objectif de réduire de 30% nos émissions de gaz à effet de serre et même l'ambition d'être demain la petite ville la plus écologiste d'Europe. Mais je pense que je ne serai pas le seul, il y aura de la concurrence, c'est très bien. L'action de ces villes pour la promotion des transports publics propres, la lutte contre le changement climatique ou le logement abordable sont de bons exemples. N'oublions pas qu'en ce qui concerne la réalisation des objectifs du développement durable, 65% des objectifs ne peuvent être atteints sans la participation pleine et entière des collectivités locales et régionales, de Dublin à Paris, de Séville à Charleroi, de Budapest à Malmö, et je pourrais dire aussi de Bruxelles à Coulennes, ma ville. Les responsables politiques progressistes sont ceux qui mènent la lutte sur le terrain pour une Europe plus durable. Je suis convaincu que c'est dans les villes et les régions que se produisent les réels changements. C'est pourquoi notre groupe a lancé la campagne Progressive Local Stories. Nous avons de nombreuses histoires à raconter, de nombreux témoignages et pratiques à partager sur la meilleure manière de réaliser les objectifs de développement durable. Il est important de les faire circuler pour qu'elles deviennent de véritables sources d'inspiration. Nous travaillons également en étroite collaboration avec les jeunes responsables politiques locaux et régionaux de notre famille politique. Ils sont à l'origine du changement grâce à leur action innovante et courageuse. Il ne s'agit pas simplement de les écouter, mais de leur donner des responsabilités, comme c'est le cas en Allemagne avec l'arrivée de nombreux jeunes responsables politiques du Jusos au Bundestag. Mais les villes et les régions ne peuvent mener cette bataille pour une Europe et une planète plus durable. Nous avons besoin de l'Union européenne pour remettre les objectifs du développement durable au cœur de la relance et en faire une priorité pour notre avenir. Nous avons besoin d'une stratégie globale pour les objectifs de développement durable. Il doit faire l'objet d'une intégration et d'une coordination dans la gouvernance interne de la Commission européenne si nous voulons progresser dans leur mise en œuvre d'ici à 2030. Cela signifie que les objectifs du développement durable doivent être mieux intégrés dans le semestre européen et davantage associés à l'instrument de la facilité pour la reprise et la résilience. Et de ce point de vue, le 26 novembre prochain à Séville, nous nous réunirons avec entre le groupe socialiste du Comité des régions et les parlementaires européens et également aussi nos jeunes élus pour donner un top départ à cette campagne pour les objectifs du développement durable en présence de Juan Espadas, actuellement maire de Séville, et je l'espère demain président de la région Andalousie, et nous accueillerons le Premier ministre espagnol, Pedro Sánchez, et il y a encore temps pour les jeunes élus en particulier de s'inscrire à cet événement. Je me réjouis à présent, pour terminer, de pouvoir écouter les nombreux orateurs présents et participer à un débat qui, je l'espère, sera fructueux, auquel vous pourrez tous apporter votre contribution politique, pas simplement technique et technocratique, grâce à vos idées nouvelles et pertinentes. Merci de votre attention et bon débat.
Christophe Rouillon, thank you. Congratulations on that very high ambition to be the greenest small city in Europe. And as you say, the SDGs are all about leaving no one behind. And it's important that these goals are integrated into Europe's policy making so that they can be at the heart of Europe's recovery. Now, you may know that the Progressive Society's Independent Commission for Sustainable Equality, made up of former government leaders, current MEPs, mayors, and academics, published a first report in 2018 calling for a radically different Europe. At the end of the month, the Commission will publish its second report. And I'm delighted to introduce the former Prime Minister of Denmark, former President of the Party of European Socialists, and the co-chair of the Independent Commission, Poul Nyrup Rasmussen, who will say a few words about the second report. And perhaps if I could ask Mr. Rasmussen to unmute himself, that would be wonderful.
There we go. Is that better?
Sir. That's much better when we can hear you.
Okay, can you see me also?
Absolutely.
Okay. No, I was just going to say thank you to Christophe for his intervention and for underlining the importance of the regions. Actually, the more we go into the deep analysis in our independent commission by all the 30 experts we have, which all of them are engaged in our challenge, the more it seems to me the importance of the Committee of Regions and of the regions as a precondition to obtain our SDGs realization within Europe. You know, all of you, that in the old times, since the Second World War, we've been used to always look at the growth in GNP, the gross national product, as you could say, a sort of rising tides lifts all the boats, right? That is no longer the way to go, as we have documented in our report, because now it seems clear that this old recipe of growth is no longer fitting our purpose. What we see, all of you colleagues, is low paid and precarious jobs. We see regional unemployment. We see entire regions left behind, all attentions resting on so-called economically dynamic hubs. They are there, but what about the rest? And we see growing greenhouse gas emissions and environmental destructions. And again, I feel it's necessary to underline that we see a really dangerous combination of regions left behind. And exactly those regions left behind are the ones who are hardly hit by climate changes and greenhouse gas emissions. So, conclusion very shortly is we need a new logic for policy making. And colleagues and friends, our proposal for a new model is very simple in a way. What we need is legally binding obligations, not only at the European level, but also at the member state level and also at the regional level, to ensure our goals on social, on economic, on ecological developments managed by a sustainable well-being promoting for regions and people. So, just like what we did recently on the EU climate action law, obliging all in the European Union to become carbon neutral by 2050. Now, having this goal before us, what we propose is to move this goal to 3-4 very central obligations. Number one is an EU anti-poverty law obliging EU policy to work towards the full eradication of poverty by 2050, exactly as the overall general climate goals are defined. Secondly, a EU sustainable job guarantee to oblige member states to offer active labor market policy and job opportunities to the long-term unemployed. And thirdly, a EU biodiversity law that sets concrete and binding targets for the protection and regeneration of ecosystems. Now, friends, let me just then on my final remarks say that we also propose to embed this new model of making policy in a new system of governance. For us, it is important that such governance is long-term oriented, is evidence-based, and is participatory. Our ideas is, again, straightforward. What we want to do is farewell to the EU top-down model, and listen, regions, you have to do as we have decided up here without asking you. What we want to introduce now is to say our idea is that the European Union, the member states and region work together as part of one process that is based on a common commitment to sustainability and people's well-being, so that every actor know exactly what do we have to do within the same process. Based on this commitment, the different levels of government would work together to draw up joint plans that are defined on the basis of top-class expertise and that can draw pooled resources that is a substantially larger EU budget. Now, if you do that, I would say that again, it boils down to farewell to a top-down alone and goodbye to a cross-section of three actors going together in this new cooperation. It's importantly that we envisage a system where goals and commitments are common, but instruments and local priorities can be flexible. We are thus seeking to avoid the mistakes of the current EU semesters and its top-down modus operandi. That's in short, and I would love to come back to deepening out the different aspects for you. But let me just run off and saying that the role of local and regional policy is the key, because without that, playing its proper role as I described, we will not reach our goal as we just talked about. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rasmussen, as you said, many of those regions that are being left behind are due to impact of climate change, perhaps also because of the pandemic. You no longer want this top-down governance. What role do you see for regional and local politics? How can they make their voice heard? How can they shift the logic so it's bottom up and not top down?
I would say we need to have a common obligation saying that before you make final decisions at the European level or at the member state parliamentary level, you have to integrate public hearings and public processes of local and regional democratic units, which simply means that your decisions will not be legal, will not be acceptable without having integrated the process of the local and regional voice. And let me just add to that on your question, that to make sure that our policy is real, we need to develop detailed data that represents the situation on the ground, so we know where exactly in which regions and in which type of local communities we need to intervene with higher public support of different kinds. That could be public services, that could be increasing incomes, that could be local investment initiatives. So really precise data is integrating participation democracy as precondition for making common policy.
There are many data gaps for the indicators for the SDGs. And of course, the most vulnerable, those who are left behind, they're sometimes very difficult to access in terms of data collection. What would you like to see so that their data is collected and so the policies can be made and their voices can be heard?
I think what one of the things we could consider would be to have a urgent reaction, rapid reaction force from regional and from European and member states level to the regions which really need actual actions. In a sense, you could say just a quick reaction force which is coming before the disaster is coming, right? We have learned something during the climate disasters up till now from Germany and from other regions, that coming too late is disastrous and make the local disaster even going faster. But trying to come before is coming up at the maximum is key here. And that means that we need to have a EU instrument to co-finance member states' actions directed toward local and regional level. And then alongside with that, we could develop the precise data. So what I'm saying is we should not wait until we have the perfect world of data, but go into it right now, starting by defining on what we know, the regions which are really in need and local, which really need action now. And then as a combination, we collect data to have the middle term and long term be perfect as we want to.
Mr. Rasmussen, thank you very much for those thoughts. And I'll be coming back to you in a moment. As you say, there's a lot still to be done at European level so that it's not so top down. But now we're going to look at the bottom up approach and some of the policies that mayors and deputy mayors of progressive cities are leading on the SDGs. And they're going to showcase what they've been doing for SDG 11, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities, but also on other SDGs. And I think it's most probably worth pointing out that while the EU has made progress on most of the SDGs over the past 5 years, the latest Eurostat monitoring report shows that the pandemic has slowed progress. The goals, perhaps unsurprisingly, most negatively affected are SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 4, quality education, SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 10, reduced inequalities. But also SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, and SDGs 15, life on land, have been negatively impacted. So first of all, I would like to give the floor to Alison Gilliland, Lord Mayor of Dublin and PES Group member, who's going to talk about how in Dublin they are implementing some of these SDGs. Alison, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire. My pleasure to be here and to contribute to this session today. I'm going to focus on SDG 11, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities, and in particular the use of smart technology and citizen science to resolve environmental challenges and how we are increasing active mobility across the city. So I'm going to talk about Smart Dublin. If I can get my slide to move, yeah. Smart Dublin is a Dublin City Council hub that was set up in 2015 to basically allow us to develop an innovative ecosystem across the city and become more responsive. So we look at 6 particular thematic areas: the environment, people, mobility, the economy, government, and living and citizen well-being. And they're very much interlinked with all the SDGs, but also with the sustainability perspective. And in this, we very much work across our own communities, citizens, researchers and business, tech, startups, industry, with the local council, I suppose, taking the role as enabler and facilitator and the person that brings all the people into the room. And I'm going to talk about 2 particular projects we have. One is Smart Bins, so looking at optimizing and innovating waste management. So we would have introduced what we call big belly bins, and we adapted them to have a solar powered internal compactor to compress waste. And we put sensors inside, and basically the idea was that the sensors would alert our waste management team as to when they needed to be collected or emptied. And that has actually reduced our waste collections or emptying of bins by 85%. So that's cutting down on, I suppose, maximizing resources, cutting down on energy, transport emissions as we go across the city collecting waste. We're also using them to trial air quality, noise quality, and footfall using the Internet of Things and sensors inside them. Another one you'll see there is our Smart Mobility Hub, and this is very much targeted at our own staff. We encourage them to use public transport in as far as possible to come to work, but we also very much recognise that during the working day, they may need to travel to a site in the city or to a meeting. So what we have adopted is an online booking system for our e-cars, for our electronic bikes and ordinary push bikes. So staff members can book them, they're in the car park downstairs, and they can come and go using those mobility mechanisms. It reduces emissions, and it also allows better physical health, to be quite honest with you, in some cases. And the second area I'm going to look at is, again, focusing on active mobility. And I know Paul mentioned there, and as did you, Claire, about how we have slowed in the implementations of SDG because of the COVID pandemic. Well, we actually use the COVID pandemic to increase active mobility, particularly in the area of pedestrianisation and cycling. Conscious that people needed to get around, they needed their space. But we were also conscious that we needed our cycling and pedestrian infrastructure to be inclusive. So you'll see there we have some beach maps that we use at some of our beaches to allow people with mobility issues, whether that be wheelchairs or indeed families with buggies, to get down to the beach and use a local facility. We have some trishaws, so where lesser able people are able to hop on the front of the trishaw with a more able person can cycle them around. So they can use the cycle lanes, get out into the local park and be active and come together more as a community. We're currently trialing cargo bikes. We have increased pedestrianisation in our city centre, but we need to enable businesses to have deliveries. Ideally, we don't want too many, I suppose, emitting vehicles in the city centre. So we're encouraging business to borrow one of our cargo bikes and use it for those deliveries in the last mile. Again, the idea of reducing emissions and increasing our air quality. Citizen engagement is really important to us. So we would have pedestrianised on a trial basis some of our streets, particularly to facilitate outdoor dining, to allow our hospitality industry come back post-pandemic, because we would have been very late in opening indoor dining. We allowed outdoor dining, but we don't generally have the climate like some of our Mediterranean colleagues. So we built what we call build out. So just use part of the road, reduce the road space, put outdoor dining facilities there and trial them, particularly weekend evenings. And we consulted with the public as we went along. And then we finished up our trial there just last weekend. We had a massive public consultation as to how the public see this going forward. And we very much look forward to realizing more in this space, working with our citizens, bringing them with us, allowing them to recognize the importance of implementing and achieving those sustainable development goals. So that's some of the examples we're doing in Dublin to support sustainable cities and communities.
Thank you very much, Alison, for sharing some of those examples, the smart bins and the smart mobility, indeed, smart Dublin. You said just now that you use COVID to improve active mobility. I was wondering what else you can tell us about how you're going to ensure that there is a sustainable and citizen-focused recovery from COVID in Dublin.
Yeah, well, like many cities across Europe, we've been very much challenged by COVID from an economic perspective, a residential perspective, community perspective. But as a council, and because we work across all communities across our cities, we've been able to be very responsive and agile and listen to what our citizens want. And through that listening, we have been able to put trials in place, such as the pedestrianisation, the cycleways. We are co-designing a lot of our cycleways with local residents to accommodate the idea that we would have more seniors. There might be a doctor's surgery on the road that needs a few car parking spaces, so we have to design the cycleway around that. And I think when you're very involved in the community and you work directly with them, you are raising the awareness of the need to be more climate responsive, more responsive to sustainability. But by co-creating with them, you were allowing them to have a say, and often they know what works on their road, or they know what works in their community and who can work with them. So very focused on citizen engagement, using, as you saw through Smart Dublin, technology and citizen science, and looking at how we develop our city through the lens of sustainability.
Thank you, Alison, indeed. And the key words that I can hear there are co-creation and indeed citizen engagement. And I would now like to hear from Paul Magnette, Mayor of Charleroi in Belgium and leader of the Belgian Socialist Party. Paul has previously been the Minister for Climate and Energy in the Belgian federal government. Paul, the floor is yours to tell us about the best practices you're implementing in Charleroi.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you, everyone. It's good to see some of you again, although we all hope that we'll be very soon be able to meet physically and not just via Zoom or that kind of technology, which is good, as it allows us to have a conversation, but deprives us of the pleasure of real conversation between the different sessions. So we hope we can meet again very soon. And thank you to the PES family for organizing that kind of event. I think it's very important to share experience and to make sure that when we start to implement all those broad and sometimes very abstract SDGs, we do it very concretely, and we can show to the people that when we talk of eradicating poverty or that kind of things and all the objectives that Paul has just mentioned, this is not just a very broad and abstract discourse, but it's a practice and something that we do on an everyday basis. And of course, it's important to deliver and to have strong policies and show that we can make sure that this climate transition will be and already is inclusive, and that the transition that we need to organize must be a fair transition, as Paul mentioned. We, in this respect, face what we can call a triple injustice. On the one hand, first, the poorest citizens are those who are less responsible for gas emissions, for greenhouse gas emission. Oxfam data have showed, for example, that the 1% richest people on Earth are responsible for 40 times more than the 10 poorest people, 10% poorest people in the same society. 40 times more means one rich family produces 40 times, even as much gas emission as 40 poor families. That's one injustice. Second, the poorest people are also those who are exposed to air pollution, to noise, to all kind of environmental problems which have a direct impact on their health. And we know, for example, in the EU, that every year more than 800,000 people die of air pollution, which remains a major issue and one of the first causes of mortality in Europe. And of course, it's always the people with the most difficult social situation who live in the areas which are more exposed to infrastructure, to big industry, and who work in the companies where they have to work with the chemicals and other products which have an impact on their health. And three, not only are they less responsible, not only are they more often victims than the rest of the society, but they have less access to the benefits of an environmentally fair society. They have less access to a good isolated housing. They have less access to electric cars, to a green public spaces, to organic food and that kind of things. And thus, we have a major agenda, I think, as socialists and social democrats, to make sure that this fair transition and that this fight against these new injustices related to climate transition are really dealt with. That's the output side, I would say, the policy we need to deliver. And we know how to do that. We know how to build social housing. We've invented this in the 20th century. We have invented public transportation. We have to make the public service for public transportation ever more efficient and free for everyone, like many cities in France notably are doing in Dunkerque and many other places, or like Luxembourg is doing too. We have to make sure that children in the school have access to safe food and organic food via a free school cafeteria, for example. So we have to reopen the agenda of public service, decommodifying the society and giving more chances to those who have less chance at the start of their life. We have to reopen that agenda in relation with climate transition, which is a great opportunity for us. But the input side is also very important, and this is so the way we do it is also very important. We in my city, of course, also have lots of different participatory mechanisms. We have quite classic forms of participatory mechanism, which are very close to the ones that Lord Mayor Alison Gillian has just mentioned. We have, of course, consultation of citizens on local projects of renovating a public square or renovating housing or changing mobility. We have lots of Agenda 21 and participatory reflection on the broad axis of our local project. But I would like to stress 2 or 3 things which I think are more original than things that are done nearly everywhere. The first one is that we realize that it's very difficult to make sure that this participation itself is really inclusive. More often than not, you always have more males than females, more people who are 50 plus than young people, and more white people, if I may say it this way, than colored people, and more people with a high social cultural capital than people with less less education. So we have to correct those biases in the representation, also in the forms of direct participation of the citizens. And we found different ways to do that. One is to focus on local, on thematic participation. It's very hard to ask citizens to participate in the long run. Very often, and I guess my colleagues have the same experience, citizens would come for one meeting and say, I don't agree with this, or I want that. But then to make sure that they keep coming for 2, 3, 4, 5 meetings, and that we build a real process of co-construction of the policies is much more difficult. When you work on thematic axis, we have a consultative body, for example, on gender issue, another one on mobility, and another one on disabled person, another one on animal welfare, many others. Then you have a way of involving people who have a deep interest, and very often more than interest, a real passion for one theme, and who will really get involved not just for 1 or 2 meetings, not just to say they're against the project, but also really to participate in the long run in the definition of your local project. And this works quite well. The other one is to work on a territory. People are incredibly linked to where they live, to the very small place around the place where they live. I would say 5 minutes around the place where they live. And we've built what we call participation councils, made of, we've subdivided the city into 5 parts, which is slightly more than 5 minutes around the home. It's 15 minutes around the home by foot, or so to say. And we select citizens by lot, and we submit them. Most of the projects that we have we are trying to implement in the area, and ask them for reaction, and also ask them for initiatives, for proposals. And we try and build a permanent dialogue with them, and there we have really in the methodology of selection of the citizens who take part in this participation, we have lots of criteria to make sure that all categories of the population do indeed participate, in young people and gender equality and representation of all the ethnic minorities. We have more than 150 nationalities in my city, so we have to make sure that this multicultural nature of the population is well represented in those organizations. And once a year, what we organize, and this has a wide success, and highly recommended to my colleagues and friends in the other city, we organize what we call the Citizen City Council. So it means on one of our city council, we usually have one city council per month, which is a very long 2, 3, 4, 5 hours session on Monday evening. Once a year, we replace the normal city council with a citizen city council, which means that all elected members of the city council don't take their seat. They go at the place of the public, and we leave the seat to the citizens who participate in this thematic or local participation bodies, and they replace the elected citizens just for once a year. And we members of the local executive are at our table, and we listen to them, we listen to their questions, and we try to answer them as correctly as we would do for any kind of normal city council. So once a year, they replace the elected members, and they can experience that, and it's very important to them. I mean, they know that they will have the opportunity to come with their points at some times, and to ask the mayor and to ask the associate mayors, why do you do this? How would you answer that issue, and so on. And they keep it in mind when they work on all their other very specific issues, and which gives them a major opportunity to get information, to get answers, and also to come with inputs enrich the project that we are building together. And I find that this moment, which is a moment of a formalization, I mean, they're quite proud to be in the big hall and to be on the seats of the elected members, even if it's only once a year. It's 5 or 6 times on the legislature, and it creates a momentum of democratic participation, which is really strong and which I believe can become something which will become normal with the passing of time.
Paul, thank you for sharing with us some of those very innovative ways that you're countering the bias of participation in Charleroi. A very quick question to you, because you're also president of the Belgian Socialist Party. So what are you doing at a national level to ensure that the SDGs are implemented for the benefit of cities and communities? Perhaps a brief answer, and then I'll bring in our next mayor, a deputy mayor from Budapest. But at the national level, Paul, what are you up to?
Well, we are, as you know, we have a very quite complex multi-level governance in Belgium with, of course, local, like everywhere, but regions, what we call communities, and the federal level. We are present everywhere. So that's good, because it means we can have an integrated vision and try and promote those SDGs at all levels. I think the kind of technology that we use, or methodology that we use, resembles what Paul Rasmussen just mentioned. We have targets at the different levels, and then we try to assess the level of realization of those targets. I mentioned, for example, a project which for me is very important, which is the generalization of free school cafeteria for everyone, fed with local food, with local products and local agriculture. We can't do that in one time, because it's very expensive. It's a new public service. It's very expensive, but it's very, very important to educate young people to safe food, quality food, to the pleasure of eating good things, local things, and seasonal things. So we want to do it, and every year we extend it to new cities using very objective data on where are there more needs, where is there more capacity to organize that, where can we learn more experience, and then generalize the kind of things that we do. And this is, I think, the way of every year restating this was the objective. We are at 30%, at 40%, at 45%. Also create a better visibility, a better perception by the people. Someone said, I think in the discussion just before, the conservative and the populist movement said they would take back control. We, the left, must show that we too take back control, and that we can change the world, and we can show to the citizens that yes, their vote matters, and that when they trust us, we hold our words, and we realize the promises that we mentioned during the campaign. And the fact that to be accountable on a permanent basis and to explain what you've done and what remains to be done is something, I think, which is very important. It's a kind of new democratic planification, which was used in 1950s and 60s, which become a bit old-fashioned in the liberal era. But I think we need it again. People need to know where we're going to. They need to know what are our targets and where are we. We are there. I mean, with honesty, you say, well, we haven't reached 100% yet, but we said we would do this, and we are there. And there are the obstacles. We explain why we can't go faster, but we promise that we will keep fighting for this. I think this political pedagogy, very simple and clear, is something that we need to do to rebuild confidence in democracy.
Thank you very much, Paul, for those thoughts. Let me bring into the conversation the Deputy Mayor of Budapest and PES Group Vice President Kata Tutu, who's also going to be part of the Committee of the Regions delegation to the COP26 in Glasgow in November. Katia, you're going to talk to us about some of your city's best practices linked to SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, and SDG 15, Life on Land. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the floor. I'm really pleased to be here, especially talking about biodiversity in cities. Today, the president of the Committee of the Regions signed the Edinburgh Declaration. So it's really good to share some views on what are we doing in the city level, because usually we don't think about cities when it comes to nature protection and biodiversity. So I have a slide normally, but I don't know if it's shared. Okay.
Whether we can get it to be shared by our technicians, otherwise perhaps you'll have to tell us what we should be seeing?
I just wanted to show some pictures because, like, I think most of you are familiar with the things cities do on, we can do the next one with biodiverse fields, putting out as much infrastructure for animals to occupy as possible. We just adopted, and we worked on it parallelly, our sustainable energy and climate action plan and our strategy for urban green infrastructure and biodiversity, because we think these two are absolutely interconnected. And when it comes to adaptation measures, it's really important to always look at nature-based solutions, not just building gray infrastructure when it comes to flooding and too much water. You can always look at. But it's not just when we talk about like biodiverse fields and flowers, it's what we did in Budapest. This is not just like for show and a few little fields. It means like hundreds of acres of fields we kept unmoved. And we actually seen a lot of things blooming, a lot of new species coming up, a lot of new insects coming up, and of course it brought a lot of new birds. We are working now on, we are making a special seed collection, a seed mix of Budapest. But I always have to, these are the positive things. So we see a lot of new biodiversity coming out. And I think what the most biggest thing we did was on mosquitoes, because Budapest, we face, we have a lot of mosquitoes because we have a lot of water. We are a lucky city. We have a big Danube. We have swampy places. So we normally have a lot of mosquitoes. And the old ways of lowering the number of mosquitoes was poisoning them from the air. And we changed this. We found a more biodiverse, friendly way of lowering the numbers of mosquitoes, and this is when the but comes. So normally people living in cities are really fond of the concept of green. So like living in green cities, that's great, but when it comes to the realities of green, there are some conflicts. So we faced, of course, conflicts with mosquitoes, because more nature-friendly solutions that keeps biodiversity in cities means it's not in effect so effective than it was earlier, because like citizens expect all mosquitoes to be gone like right away, and let's poison them again from the air, which actually poisoned everything else in the city and around the cities. But we stop this, and we need to explain this. When we leave these biodiverse fields, they're really beautiful when they are blooming, but they're not blooming from the beginning. And they are high, and people don't understand why we don't cut grass, because they're used to grass being cut to 2 centimeters. There's always conflict with dog owners, what kind of species live there. People don't know these species. So there's a lot to adapt to, and we have to put a lot of energy into it. I would like to just highlight one innovation, what we did, because when it comes to like living things in the cities, it's like trees. That's with what we talk about a lot. And what we see is climate change is actually needs us to rethink how we plant trees in our cities and what species of trees can we use in our cities, because everything is changing. A lot of new diseases are coming. So we have to adapt to these changes too. And what we did is, when it comes to trees, values of trees, we have a special, like a Google car, which goes around the city. And usually we used it to have a 3-dimensional map of the city's gray infrastructure. But this car and this artificial intelligence can also now recognize trees, because we combined it with a different artificial intelligence, and we taught it what kind of trees are in the city and how to recognize them. And we also have a new method of valuing trees. And this is like a Hungarian innovation. So it's the value of the tree is not calculated of how much time does it need a tree to grow, but we have special measures like how much shade does that tree can provide, how much dust does that tree absorb, how much CO2 does this tree absorb, and how much water does it evaporate. And we have a special system, and we can calculate a special value for all the trees in the city. We're doing this right away. So we are hopefully getting a register of trees with a real value, what those trees in the cities provide. I will be glad to share all this with anyone who's interested. So thank you for the opportunity. I'll give back the floor.
Kata, thank you very much for showing us what you're doing in Budapest to really green the city, and also sometimes that you need to spell out what some of the short-term disadvantages might be and how you're countering those. I'm just wondering, Kata, I mentioned at the beginning that this Eurostat monitoring report has shown the impact of the pandemic on many of the SDGs. Are you seeing a negative impact in other areas of the SDGs, perhaps, SDG 8 on decent work or on reducing inequalities in Budapest?
Oh, I see too many. I see too many. Well, the biggest struggle I have is on mobility. I'm also responsible for public transport, and we had a very high mobility share of public transport in Budapest before the pandemic. And now we see the number of cars doubled and the people using public transport halved, because our concept of space, of safe spaces changed. So we didn't know in the beginning, nobody knew that how the COVID is spreading. People were afraid, so they stopped using public transport, started using cars again. But we still want to stick to our sustainable urban mobility program, having more people using public transport, walking, cycling, and not using their cars. And this causes a lot of daily conflict in the city. There's a lot of work to be done to gain trust towards public transport again.
Kata, in one comment from Alexander here, which says, nice to hear that Parisians are not the only ones to complain about vegetalization and grass around trees when the city tries to implement it. And he says, keep up the fight in Budapest. So thank you very much to Alison and to Paul and to Kata. We'll come back to you in a moment, but I'd like to get a response now from Paul Nierup Rasmussen. I know, Paul, that you must leave in a few minutes, but you've heard some of the innovations that the cities of Budapest and Dublin and Charleroi are doing. The floor is yours for some sort of response. And if you can unmute yourself, that would be wonderful.
I will do that. Yeah, here we go. Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you. And let me just underline what Paul Magnette said about the participation methods. I think that's quite important. And Paul's experiences are corresponding to what we see among experts in my commission. And the sense is that ordinary people in their different local entities, and we should realize that those local entities in modern life even are smaller than we think. People live in relatively small areas and quite seldom move outside. So it's important to integrate democracy into that fact. And that's what Paul was talking about the goals, about the practice, and about what to do, and especially the point what to do. I think democratic talks become often theoretical if people don't feel that they have a tool they can use to act in their daily life and see progress in their daily living conditions. So again, decentralization and combining our decision process at the European level, the government level, and the regional and local level is not only theoretical talks, but really practice we need to make forward to. Before just answering two other points, I would like just to underline what I said in the beginning one more time. What we have decided up till now, friends, is that we should oblige the EU to become carbon neutral in 2050. That's the fact. We are all obliged to do that. I think we should today, and in our committee of regions here, as well as in the parliament, also decide in a similar form, as I mentioned, an EU anti-poverty law, obliging EU policy to work towards the full eradication of poverty in 2050. You know why? Because having this overall obligation, then the question will be the same, whether you are at governmental level or at local level. Okay, that is our goal. We're all obliged. How do I do it and how do they do it, so that we have this integrated process once more time. And secondly, we need to have an overall goal obliging EU sustainable jobs guarantee for long-term unemployed. And thirdly, as many of you talked about, the biodiversity. We need to have a European biodiversity law that sets concrete and binding targets for the protection and regeneration of ecosystems. And then finally, let me just say that we must create a legal obligation for member states to develop strategies to protect citizens in local areas, which means, am I outdoor?
No, you're loud and clear.
Okay. Which means that urban planning is a key word for investing in resilient infrastructure and housing. Many of you talked about housing. I can only say that experiences in the north of Europe, in my Copenhagen and other places, is a key. We are beginning now we have decided, just to be concrete to you, that 25% minimum of all housing in our cities should be social housing and should be payable for ordinary families and should be ecological perfect. So we can make, coordinated, integrated legislation and obligations which give meaning for ordinary people. And lastly, we haven't talked that much about it, but it's very, very important. That's about education and employability. Friends, in those regions where we see people really hit it by carbon intensive activities, we need a special policy to be implemented. We need simply to support workers with measures that can create a new requalifications and employability. But again, when I talk with workers and say, okay, guys, your jobs have disappeared now due to climate and because it's not affordable any longer due to carbon intensive activities, we have to find other jobs, and therefore you need to re-educate. Workers are saying to me, okay, Paul, to which kind of job should I re-educate? So you see, a very important point for us in the committee and in the European Parliament is that we're not only trying to redeploy education and qualification, it must go hand in hand with new jobs, which are affordable and which are climate friendly, which then just again make me to my final point. We need to do more on decentralization. We need to move some activities out from the big centralizations of universities and educational systems and centers to local areas where they really need to have new growth potential and hubs which can create new jobs and can create the good circle for generating new sustainable jobs. That's my final remarks, friends. Good to be with you again. And can I inform you that at the end of October here, we will publicize the total report, and I would be happy to receive remarks from you. Today, my colleagues will follow your discussion, and we will certainly integrate your points in the final report. So thank you so much. See you again, locally, regionally, and in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul Rasmussen, for your ideas. And as you said, we need a new logic for policy making. And you're mentioning an EU anti-poverty law, an EU sustainable jobs guarantee law, and a biodiversity law. And when you were mentioning them, I could see that Paul Magnette put up a thumbs up on one of those. So I would like to ask our speakers, perhaps Paul, and then Alison, and then Carter, to reflect on what Paul Rasmussen has just said. I'll begin with you, Paul Magnette, for your thoughts on what Paul Rasmussen has just said.
Well, thank you very much, Claire. I remember a very, very good report coordinated by Paul called Sustainable Equality, if I'm right, and 5 years ago, or something like, which remains a very strong inspiration for me. The basic idea is very simple. What's the purpose of social democracy today? If you want to fight poverty, to fight inequality, we have to provide universal public services to everyone on basic needs, and basic needs are always the same, and they're reflected in the selection of SDGs. They are housing, a school, where we have to have access to education, school, to health, and to job, and to correct and organic and safe food. I mean, if we manage to provide those kinds of public services to everyone, and I would add transportation, mobility, which is suddenly becoming an ever more important public service today. If we manage to provide this to everyone, we would simply eradicate poverty. We would eradicate major inequality and the reproduction of inequality from one generation to the other. So I think that the project that just mentioned by Paul is very important. Having 25% or maybe 30% of social housing, or at least of public housing in the big cities, will become a major issue. It's already the case in Vienna, and due to a long-term social democratic practice in Vienna. Used to be the case in Paris, although in Paris, the way those public housing are distributed among different categories of the population is maybe not so social anymore. But it's very important to make sure that we can offer access to housing to everyone, and also as a means of regulating housing market. When you have a huge public park of social housing, you have an impact on the market, you have an impact on the prices, also an impact on the private housing. This is one example I would take. The other one is very wide offer and free public transportation, also in the big cities, but not only in the big cities. It's become a very huge cost for many families. Many families have to. Everyone cannot afford a car, especially in big cities, and it's a good thing if the number of car goes down with the new generation using bikes and going by foot and different kind of things. But we also need public transportation. Not all cities are as flat and as comfortable as Copenhagen, for example, to generalize bikes. It's not so easy in Brussels, although there's a lot of room for improvement in a city like Brussels, and including in my city of Charleroi. So public transportation will also remain important. And if they became free for everyone, and we can begin with young people or with the elderly, this would be a major change, I think, in the direction of a more universal public services, which in the same time, we always have to think of social and green or ecological as the two faces of the same coin. We have to think of the reforms which always help us to go in the direction of climate transition and reduce inequality in the same time. And those examples of social housing or public transportation or free cafeteria, school cafeteria, I think are maybe the best examples.
Thank you very much, Paul. Let me bring in Alison. Alison, I know that you've been the chairperson of the Dublin City Council's Strategic Policy Committee on Housing. So perhaps you might want to reinforce the point that both Pauls have been making about housing, but otherwise, please do give us your reflections on what Paul Neerup Rasmussen has been saying.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is actually moving from knowing what we have to do to actually doing it. And we can talk about the changes, but that's not really going to achieve change. So given the regulatory and legislative role of the EU and our parliamentarians, I know Paul mentioned an EU law, anti-poverty law, biodiversity law, like get doing it. And then I think the second challenge is actually to funnel finance and funding directly down to local authorities, to cities and regions, as opposed to national governments, because we in Ireland find that, you know, we apply for URDF funding through our national government, we submit projects that we have, I suppose, a very sustainable perspective on, is that we need multi-annual long-term funding to realise, and we end up getting a small percentage of what we actually need, which means we can't actually implement the entire project, and we're losing the impact of that. With regard to housing, you know, to me, the EU needs to get tough on stemming the commodification of housing. It's been traded on global markets. It's not seen as a housing right. We do have difficulties from a financial perspective, actually investing in capital, building houses. We're told we can't. We can absolutely pay landlords housing assistance payments to house our social housing people who are waiting on a house. But we are constrained when it comes to actually making investment in social and affordable housing. And I do think that there's a role there, because housing is an absolutely critical issue for us in Dublin, I'm sure for other cities. It's not only the roof over your head, it's access to employment, it's access to a better environment and your own well-being and your ability to participate as a citizen in society. And we really need to work with our citizens. And if they're in a space that they don't have those, I suppose, human capacities to engage in sustainable development, because they're worried about paying their rent, or they're worried about, you know, how am I going to get a job because I keep having to move from homeless shelter to homeless shelter, you know, it's really not going to work. So from an EU perspective, I said my message is enable us through your legislation and funding directly to us at local authority levels to do what we know we need to do.
Thank you very, very much, Alison. Let me bring in Kata to ask for your reflections on what Paul Nierup Rasmussen was saying. He was saying that we need to change the logic of policy making and came up with some suggestions for different laws. Katia, your thoughts?
Oh, yes, I have a lot on both of the polls. But first, I would agree absolutely with the mayor, Alison, on our roles and as leaders of cities. On poll on public transport, Budapest just introduced free public transport for children under 14. Already public transport is free for citizens over 65. We also think this is really important, and I also agree that public transport is a universal public service, so it has to be affordable. So I totally agree. On the policies, having more laws, so facing day-to-day realities, on implementing all of our goals and all of our strategies. Everybody has to understand that, like, every region is starting from a different level. And we see a lot of cities who've been on the green track for a long time, and they can go faster and faster, and their citizens are coming with them. And we see a lot of regions where we're really far away, and it's hard to start to move on the road. And we are asking citizens a lot to change everything, how they consume, how they select their waste, how they transport. We want to put a lot of pressure on education, on the teachers. We want the teachers to do everything, teach the children everything. So we are putting a lot on our citizens, a lot on educations, and I'm always afraid that if it's too much, and if we don't reflect on that, they will move out. So what we see in the end, because the COVID crisis we're so in it, we see it's not enough to have scientific papers and scientists telling you about the climate reality, because what we see in the COVID crisis and the anti-vaccine movements, that science is not enough. You have to engage citizens. We know that it's the climate crisis doesn't have it's not the solution of the persons, of the individuals. Because as a community and European and national, international level, we have to do a lot of things. And of course, there have to be a lot of laws. But what I say is that we have to engage citizens to do something little at least, because if your citizens are engaged, if they're not overwhelmed, they're not expected to do too much from like zero to like everything, just a little, if they get engaged, if they get some positive reaction, if they see that what they do has some positive results, then hopefully they won't vote for populist politicians who will say the whole stuff is a hoax, because these are the things we fear, because not every city and not every region is on the same level. And a lot of times what I see is that it's like, I always use this analogy, the train car, that there's an engine that moves faster and faster and faster, but there are a lot of train cars that will lose the train cars. They cannot move so fast. So there always has to be a reflection. And this is why it's important. It's not just us mayors want to spend more money. Of course, we want to spend more money, but this is not just about spending more money. We see the realities of introducing a new policy and the reaction of the citizens, and we have to deal with it, and we have to have them on board. Otherwise, politics works like that. Somebody will come and say, you don't have to do this, this is stupid. And then we're lost with our goals. Thank you for the floor.
Thank you very much. And I would like to encourage our audience to post questions too. There is one that's come up, which is about COP26. Of course, it's 3 weeks ago, I believe. And it would be very interesting to know what you would like to come out of COP26. So perhaps, Katja, because I know that you must leave us in a few minutes and that you're going as the Committee of the Regions representative to the COP26, I'll begin with you before going to Alison and Paul Magnette. What would you hope that will come out of it, especially in terms of, helping your citizens? Katja, I begin with you.
Yes, thank you very much. I won't hurry now because I rearranged the program, but thank you. What I'm bringing to the COP is what I'm working now in the Committee of the Regions is gender and climate, gender and the Green Deal. And why is it important for cities? Why a women's perspective should be added to the big debate we're moving on. Because with the Green Deal, with the recovery and resilience, with all these goals, we are aiming to transform our societies, our cities, without knowing how will this affect men and women. And we know a lot about the realities. We know about huge gender gaps today. We know of the COVID crisis having a women's face. We know that energy poverty has a female face. And what we don't know is that if we are transforming everything, and without gender mainstreaming, without having data, without having a gender impact analysis, we don't know that if these gaps will widen or become smaller. So this is what I'm bringing. We don't have enough women in decision making, not enough women in the main positions. We are talking a lot about green jobs, but when we look at the new green jobs, we see it in science, in technology, in engineering, mathematics, and we don't have enough women there. We see a huge gender gap over there. If we look at our cities, the main users of public transport are women. When I look at the car users, if there's one car in one family, it's usually the man who is using that car, and we use our cities so differently. If I look at the personal lifestyle choices, what we see is that it's much more, it's women who take up these decisions. And when we look at it, why is it that women do it and they separately collect waste and use public transport and go for nature-based solutions, and why men do it less? And when researchers were looking at it, they found it that our societies think that it is not manly enough, it is not masculine enough. We are facing a lot of stereotypes, gender-based stereotypes, and there is a lot of room there. One of our cities in Sweden found out that if men would use public transport the same share as women do, it would have more CO2, it would end up in more CO2 reduction than changing their whole bus fleet into electric buses. So there's a lot of room there. I want to bring a women's perspective in the COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kata. Alison, you're in Dublin. You most probably won't be going, therefore, to Glasgow. But what would you like to come out of it that will really help the people of Dublin?
Well, I think if we got the woman's perspective, as Katja has so eloquently expressed, we could make real change. Because women are a lot of the time the people left working on the ground to try and grapple with climate change, to grapple with sustainability, but they are not the people that always get the resources to do that. So if we had that gender perspective, a really strong gender perspective, we could change a lot. But along a similar line, it's around the just transition, and those who are living in poverty, whether that be energy poverty or transport poverty or unemployment, housing poverty and housing precarity, that there needs to be, I suppose, a more realistic perspective on what we need to do. I think a lot of the time it's a high level debate, but it actually doesn't filter down. And going back to my other point of doing what we need to do, and how do we have, an idea of how the top level dialogue can actually be translated into tangible implementation on the ground. And I think that's very much missing. What I would like every single country attending COP to do is to present the progress they have made in reducing their emissions since the last time, and how they're going to reduce them even further, and really show that promise in action. I sometimes think it's, one country is waiting for the other country to move because there's that economic competitiveness. And if we could see the same, I suppose, sustainability competitiveness among particularly the G7 countries and the larger economies, then I think we'd be really getting some action. I don't think it's taken as the crisis it actually is. And I'm just not feeling it. I'm not, it's not filtering down. Our citizens are actually way ahead of national governments because they see the urgency, and particularly our young people. And Katja referenced populist voting. People can be very easily drawn into easy solutions because our national politicians are not the best at communicating complex ideas and concepts. So I think we have a chance. We have very little chance left, and COP really needs to deliver this time around. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Paul Magnette, what would you like to see out of COP26 so that it really does deliver for the citizens of Charleroi?
Well, I will be in Glasgow too, and will be very happy to meet the colleagues there. I would mention something which maybe does not have a direct impact on the citizens of Charleroi, but on the big issues of climate change in general. I think for me the major challenge of Glasgow is international climate justice. In Copenhagen, 12 years ago, we committed ourselves to provide the poorest countries of the world with $100 billion a year to help them in the adaptation, mitigation, and all the investments they need to make simply to avoid the consequences of climate change. We are very far from it, very, very far from it. So we need to do something about that. And we need to, I mean, if we want to guarantee that this will become ever more binding, even if it's not legally binding, but ever more politically binding, we have to respect what the commitments that we took, and to show that we deliver. We promised that 12 years ago. Now we have to do it. It's not just a question of money and technology transfer, it's also a question of coherence. And I think one of the elements on which we should act very urgently is a complete reform of international trade. Because we can have the best policies for climate transition, we can support the poorest countries, we can send them a lot of money, we can transfer all the technologies, if in the same time trade continues to create unfair competition between different regions of the world, if we can continue to exploit those countries and their resources, and to compete with them, their own production, with our own production at lower cost, which impedes them from developing their own industry and agriculture, we will be very far from what we need to do. And this is also in our interest. So I would argue for a European carbon tax, at a border carbon tax, to make sure that the countries which do not respect the standards that we impose to ourselves will have to pay a tax if they send the products to us. And I would plead for mirror clauses in the trade agreements, which implies that when we have a rule protecting the environment, protecting the public health, protecting the citizens and the workers' rights, if other regions do not respect this, we will not import their goods. So as to promote our standards and make them universal standards, not just for us, but also for the protection of the rights of the people in those poorest countries. So I hope that Glasgow will conclude with some very clear commitments in terms of international climate justice. Now, the European Union has become a leader. The US wants to be part of the game. China wants to be part of the game. Now it's time for the countries in the South, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, to feel that they are part of this huge process, and that they are supported by the richest countries.
Thank you very much. So lots of expectations. Obviously, the whole world's eyes will be on COP26 in Glasgow to see if it's going to deliver. In a moment, I'm going to go to the first Vice President of the European Committee of the Regions to give some closing remarks. But before I do, mayors and deputy mayors, I learnt a few weeks ago about this brilliant American political theorist, Benjamin Barber, who wrote the book, If Mayors Ruled the World. It was mentioned at a conference I was moderating. So I have a question for each of you. I'll very quickly, I'll go from Paul, Alison, and then Carter. If there was one thing that you could do if mayors ruled the world, for your vision of a sustainable and just Europe, what would it be? Paul, Alison, and then Carter.
Well, I'll come back to what we said earlier. I think a set of 5 or 6 kind of SDGs, but that we can implement at local level, where we have strong competencies at local level: housing, schools, health, food, public transportation, a sort of international commitment to provide this universally to all the citizens, and to guarantee that all the investments that we would make in this direction, for example, will not be prohibited by the European Union or any kind of other superior authority, but that they will be supported.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Alison, if mayors ruled the world.
Yeah, I'd like to see a bottom-up approach to everything we do, and the legislation. I know from sitting on the Committee of the Regions that we always complain that our voice as cities and regions isn't acknowledged, and we're at the ground level implementing this. So real, tangible, respectful engagement with mayors and the regions, and to listen to them in a real way.
Thank you. And Carter, your thought if mayors ruled the world?
Well, if mayors rule the world, we would see much more women in power, adding a women's perspective, understanding how we live, our struggles. We would have much more smiling European women. So yeah, women should rule. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much to our mayors and deputy mayors for their thoughts on if mayors should rule the world, but also more seriously, perhaps, the things that they're doing, the concrete things that they are doing to make sure that their citizens benefit from the Sustainable Development Goals. It's now my pleasure to ask Vasco Alves Cordero, First Vice President of the European Committee of the Regions and member of the Azores Regional Parliament, to give the closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. This is very exciting, but very challenging after everything that was said here today, to try to summarize it and to stress some strong points. So many things have been presented on how progressive cities implement the Sustainable Development Goals on the ground. Even though each city has its own challenge and finds its own solution, this is a way to put in practice the United in Diversity motto. It became clear that the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals can only happen if we work together from global to local level, leaving no people and no places behind. We have to keep in mind that this was one of the ideas that was stressed, that COVID-19 pandemic represents the last warning to all of us, and that far-reaching political change must happen now. I want to particularly highlight the importance of the concept of sustainable well-being. For our political family, social justice and environmental policies must go hand in hand, because to achieve a just transition, we need everyone on board. But we also need, and I would like to stress the idea of Poul Rasmussen, of a clear orientation. Each one of us can be able to implement, to put in practice, to adapt, but we need a very clear orientation. This is our goal. This is where we're heading. So we've heard today that ideas from Budapest, Dublin, Charleroi are already working, and they are only some of the examples of what's happening across Europe and across the world. They are working to improve and to implement, the Sustainable Development Goals on the ground. It is clear. Progressive cities and regions are already in transformation. But let us not forget, a transformation of this scale also need finances, resources for investment, and they must be flexible. The instruments need to be flexible because there are so different realities, they need to be flexible. In the PES group in the Committee of the Regions, under the leadership of Christophe Rouillon, that's what we are doing. We're fighting for these resources. We're fighting for the adequate way to put them in practice. We also know that money alone does not bring all the change we need. We need people on board too. And in fact, we need a true involvement of all our partners, not just with words, but with a renewed and strengthened partnership that can lead to a societal mobilization. Workers, trade unions, businesses, civil society, political parties, political movements, They all play a crucial role in this transformation. But let me stress something that Kata said, it seems very important. We cannot take the risk of losing the connection with citizens. All this transformation, all this ambition, it's only worth of it if people can see themselves in this ambition. They can understand why are my mayor, my regional, my government, why are they asking me to do this? If we lose the link, if we lose the connection, we compromise this ambition, we compromise the possibility to have this change. Pardon me. So the SDGs need to become part of the overarching priority of the European semester and the EU's economic governance. Europe's economic paradigm turned a blind eye to the social crisis, and after the COVID pandemic, it is more urgent than ever to change this to show that the EU can and will improve people's lives. In this particular, let me stress again, we local regional authorities, we have the responsibility to translate to everyday life of our citizens, what does it mean, the European semester? What does it mean, the economic priorities? Because this is all very interesting, but the world is not inside this room. The world is outside, and people outside feel in a very different way. Let me remind the words of Alison. Citizens are ahead of governments in some aspects because they feel every day the need for change in some aspects of their lives. And this is also a way that governments can lose the connection if they are not leading the transformation, but they are being dragged by society. So this is a very important, at least I think it's a very, very important issue. Europe's, the Conference on the Future of Europe is a very good opportunity to make the voice of citizens heard, as sustainable development is a core principle of the treaty, but we need the EU to deliver on sustainability in Europe and beyond. The climate crisis. The climate crisis is here, and we need to act together from the global to the local level. This is why I hope we still see in a few, this is what I hope we will see in a few weeks at the COP26 in Glasgow. We need to use this occasion to bring forward our key messages on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I am sure, I am absolutely sure and confident that Kata, together with Juan Espadas, Mayor of Seville, who are part of the delegation of the Committee of the Regions at the COP, will make sure the voice of progressive cities and regions is heard. Let me stress now the Progressive Local Stories campaign by the PES Group. Many of us in our virtual audience today have a responsibility in our cities or regions for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I invite all of you to join this campaign, to add your voice to the voice of so many others that are struggling and fighting for this. Bring your ideas to inspire others. Share your practices. Share your best practices. Innovative and courageous actions are needed, and as local and regional politicians, I know we can achieve them. 2030 is right in front of us. We only have a few years to make sure that the vision of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals becomes reality. no poverty, gender equality, climate action, and all the other goals may have started globally, but we need to translate them to local realities. And they need to become the guide of our recovery. Your leadership at local and regional level will be of the utmost importance. As progressives, in particular, we need to lead, to mobilize, to push this political agenda for all people and the planet. Now, let me conclude by thanking again all speakers and participants for their valuable input. The PES group in the European Committee of the Regions, under the leadership of Christophe Rouillon and our friends from Progressive Society in the S&D group in the European Parliament, for joining forces in this important topic. Last but not least, let me thank today's moderator, Claire. Thank you so much for your excellent work, and also to the technical team for facilitating this change. Without them, it would have not been possible. From my side, from my part, thank you for your attention and have a nice evening. And interpreters, thank to them, interpreters. Thank you, Christophe.